Hello and welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Michael Slone, who is currently a PhD candidate at Case Western Reserve University, and he's studying the sociology of work and algorithmic control in the workplace. So, Michael, welcome for being on.
Thanks, Larry. Good to be with you.
Yeah, so maybe tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how did you get into this, labor research and, how did you grow up and yeah, just about yourself.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess my sociological interest in work and technology and economic change is kind of bookended by these two crises we've experienced in the last 15 years, right? So I started graduate school um, probably like a lot of people in 2008 and 2009 after I um, finished my bachelor degree. I went on to study at the University of Massachusetts Lowell in this interdisciplinary program started by folks like Chris Tilley and Bill Lazonick that really approached sort of regional economic development. And this was at the time sort of the height and the fallout of the Great Recession, right? This major crisis that everybody was hailing as the worst economic recession since the Great Depression, and since then, obviously, the COVID crisis has eclipsed that. So I became really interested and had this personal connection growing up in Northeast Ohio to how manufacturing workers and communities in decline. So derisively, this area is called the Rust Belt in the United States, right? How do these workers that become structurally displaced kind of navigate the new economy as it was being called at the time? Um, and then the sort of the personal connection is as I started grad school, my dad had worked in manufacturing all his life at a firm for 37 years. Ends up getting downsized, is the kind of the economistic term people use. And had worked at this manufacturing plant, like I said, for 37 years through several corporate buyouts and mergers, and basically lost all of his retirement savings and pension as a result of this. So at that time, his plant closed, and I did my thesis work on sort of him and the fellow manufacturing workers that were displaced in this really scary time in that scary economy. So that was the crisis that started my sociological interest. At that time, I was definitely more interested in, I would say, economics and regional development. But eventually, I finished at Lowell and I wrote my thesis on kind of the sociological impacts of downsizing in these sort of Rust Belt communities and how workers navigate that new economy. To doing my doctoral work here at Case Western in Cleveland. And I finished all my coursework, and then this second major economic crisis occurs with the pandemic. And at that point, um, I was teaching a little bit in the department. I have an adjunct job through UMass Lowell. But I was also engaging in sort of side hustles, the sort of gig economy work, just to kind of support myself through grad school and support my family. Um, and it ended up growing into kind of a project at the height of the pandemic, participant observation study of how, gig workers navigate algorithmic control and precarity. So what do workers in this area, and my field area is sort of the same as that thesis work, is this sort of corridor from Cleveland to Akron, what formerly was a major kind of steel producing region that's been deindustrialized over the last 40 or 50 years. So the I guess the project that maybe we'll talk about a little bit today, as I'm kind of coming down the home stretch of my dissertation writing, is sort of examines how workers navigate the gig economy and algorithmic control. Like, what type of workers are doing this? How does the technology change? And just general questions about the labor process of this sort of new economic frontier of precarious work.
Yep. So precarious work and certainly. the interaction that it has with modern day technologies. I mean, we know from the kind of classical sociology literature, right? Marx basically, and then later Braverman, that the capitalist will use the technologies to de-skill the work tasks, and then in that way, um, the position of the workers kind of weakens, right? And then in a later phase, automation also then becomes more significant, right? So yeah, so in the places that you studied it, I guess the food delivery and the ride-hailing business, yeah, I mean, how would you kind of integrate these, you could say Marxist labor process theories into those field sites that you studied?
Sure. So, I guess just talking about my cases a little bit here first, or what I was doing as a participant observer. So, a lot of people would call this work ethnographic. I make a distinction between ethnography and participant observation because I was active as a worker, doing field work and spent a lot of time, frankly, in my car and in parking lots, um, doing this kind of work. So what it kind of attracts me, well, let me just say about the cases. So according to my IRB protocol, I can't name the companies because of legal and they weren't so much concerned with sort of any ethical or scientific issues with outing some of these firms. They were more concerned with legalistic questions because the major company that sort of comes to mind when we think about gig work is Uber, and they're very litigious. And as part of your terms of service, you're not allowed to be sharing or collecting data on anything relating to their algorithm, which is essentially what I was doing, kind of from an ethnographic or field note and interview methods perspective. So the cases that I have are one's ride hailing. I call it hired rides. I also did food delivery, which became kind of essential during the pandemic, and I call that Get Grub. I also did a lot of grocery shopping on this platform I call Grocery Getter. And then there's a fourth platform that I study that I call Hired Hands, which is kind of a clearinghouse. It's this peer-to-peer labor uh, kind of, I guess you could call it a clearinghouse of freelance work where my gigs ran the gamut of, I actually built a landscaping business through it, but also sort of moving a lot of heavy labor, and even moving companies will kind of resort to subcontracting through this platform. But where labor process theory kind of comes back into this for me is, I've noticed it's sort of this general trend across the discipline and the networks I know that you're involved with, in terms of the ASA and stuff, is a lot of sociologists of work overlap with the sociology of labor in labor movements, and there tends to be a lot of focus on these um, macro or collective resistance or labor union organizing. And as you know, in the field of so-called gig work, there is labor union organizing going on, but it's prohibitive in the institutional and labor law of the United States, as independent contractors can't necessarily organize. They're not afforded protections in the Fair Labor Standards Act or National Labor Relations Act to collectively bargain. So I draw on the more, I guess you might call it, micro-sociological approach of labor process theory, which basically, dating back to Marx and his writings in Capital, is the ways in which work is managed and coordinated. Technology becomes a big piece of this, as you alluded um, to generate surplus value, right? The ways in which the worker is controlled by management. Marx famously called this sort of the hidden abode of production. that the classical economists and political economists didn't necessarily talk very much about. Um, and I wanted to kind of pierce or look into and experience this firsthand of the ways in which the work gets controlled and what it looks like, what are the working conditions. And importantly, the writing I'm doing right now is on what workers, given the institutional limitations that I talked about, not being afforded collective bargaining rights, being exempted from a lot of workplace protections in the Labor Standards Act, what workers can do in this limited institutional environment to kind of push back or navigate that labor process in a way that's beneficial to them. So that's the more, micro sociological or ethnographic work and field work that I've done is documenting that. And I recruited during my field work a small end sample of 20 workers across these various platforms. It's racially and, surprising to me, very economically diverse sample of workers that are doing this. And they engage in a variety of strategies to within this labor process to maximize earnings, to sort of express or develop some sense of agency against this control that maybe we can talk about. Sort of again, though, within these institutional limitations that they have, a lot of this resistance occurs at an individual level. Which isn't necessarily sexy to a lot of sociologists. And given the discipline's focus on particularly labor movement organizing, these individual forms of resistance probably don't get enough sort of purchase or attention in sociology. But I think that they're important and a sort of salient feature of resistance to precarious and algorithmic control.
Yeah, so just conceptually, I mean, would you equate the objective to maximize your earnings on the platform with resistance? Because you could also make the argument, well, I mean, they're just, trying to make a living and whatever ways. I mean, I suppose it's about logging into more than one app, right? And then if there's a downtime in the one app, then you are logged into another. Um, and that's kind of the neoliberal paradise, I suppose you can call it that, according to like the most standard versions of neoliberal thinking. Um, and because my vision of the resistance would be that you're trying to you know reduce your level of cooperation with the platform, but not necessarily uh, about enhancing your earning potential. So
Sure,
this,
that's a good
yeah,
that's a good point, a good critique to kind of bookmark here, I guess. Um, I would say beyond the neoliberal paradigm, which obviously I don't want to be overly critical of my respondents in the ways that they strategize to make the most of their time, even though it is in some ways in on certain platforms in direct violation of the terms of service agreements that they sign. I'll talk about some of those specific strategies. But I think one thing or one promising feature that you may be alluding to in the more sort of collective forms of resistance I talk about is gaming the game. So a lot of this work or a lot of these platforms were designed to be specifically game-like. There's a gamification element to this. Noam Schreiber of the New York Times wrote this sort of piece on Uber, who's kind of a leader in gamifying the Uber platform to appeal to kind of our senses in really a younger generation's comfortability with gaming and earning superlatives that don't really necessarily mean very much in terms of their pay, but they've even hired famously behavioral economists and psychologists to design the platform according to these principles of behavioral psychology and economics. Um, so workers are kind of responding to this um, gamified platform in various ways. And one of the movements, some scholars call these sort of decentralized collective movements, that's attempting to game the algorithm itself is, I don't know if you've heard of Decline Now.
No.
Decline Now is it's essentially it's a group that started on Facebook and some of these political action or petition websites like change.org. Right now on Facebook, I think they have like 52,000 members. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to educate gig workers, particularly new gig workers that sign up for like a food delivery platform, about what it means in the aggregate to decline low paying orders. And if you can drive enough individuals sort of to have this consciousness to decline shitty orders, delivering, say, a fast food order 7 miles for $2, which is basically an order with no tip. The more that you decline those orders, the food delivery platforms will begin kicking in 50 cents at a time to drive up the wages. And if that's done collectively in a localized market like where I'm at, it's a small town of about 30,000 people, if you can get dozens of workers doing that, it lifts wages, piece rate wages. But a lot of these platforms, and particularly food delivery, this is true about ride hail as well, is they rely on and in terms of economic sectors, they rely on new workers constantly, and they have the highest levels of churn of any economic sector. So some of the survey research done on this has found that on average, if you extrapolate out their rate of churn, which is about 500%, the average gig worker on these platforms works for about 2 months and then quits because new workers or new incoming workers are uneducated workers about how these algorithms work. You only learn that with time, with patience, and importantly, with talking to other people and networking with other gig workers, which are some of the things that I've seen and tried to do in the field from kind of an activist perspective. But when you have this level of churn and you have all of these new workers, it collectively and in the aggregate drives wages down. Um, so Decline Now is one of these movements that's decentralized, trying to educate new workers on how the algorithm works, how to circumvent the algorithm. And the platforms themselves, this is for anybody that's involved in Decline Now or as a Facebook member, essentially goes against their terms of service because you're manipulating the algorithm by making a political and conscious choice to decline orders. Now, folks, that's somewhat the purview of the worker or the delivery driver to decline those orders because the more you're declining, the less pay you're making per hour. But it's sort of a overcoming the collective action problem. It is an effective strategy and seems to me to be one way to kind of push back against this algorithmic control beyond those individual level ways to maximize, or the sort of neoliberal, or what they call it, and what the industry itself drives on is this narrative about hustle culture, right? Being driving 14 hours a day because you're driven, because you want to be your own boss, because you're a hustler out there in the economy trying to make the most of your time. So I'm sympathetic to those critiques that individuals have bought into this paradigm, but there are collective and sort of new collective organizing ways to combat algorithmic control.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing I would wonder about is, how effective things like decline now are going to be, because I would imagine that you would have to get a significant number of buy-in. That is to say, I don't know, let's say at least 50% of the drivers in a certain region, I mean, just picking an arbitrary number, would have to be aware of, that decline now exists and subscribe to that and, follow it. And, is that like enough? I mean, like what is I suppose, the threshold that you would have to reach in order to drive up the pay?
Yeah, I would say, and not knowing enough, and these algorithms are constantly changing. And the one thing that I couldn't do, because there's an aspect of this that it's probably clear to people is somewhat covert ethnography, but I don't want the companies to know that I'm engaging in research while I'm active on these apps. That I can't really say, in particular, like give you a figure for like you're in Baltimore, I think, right?
Yeah.
That like what, given the amount of drivers they have, which is already it's completely in flux, the number of people that are on the platform may not be active on the platform, like what that threshold is, I can't say, but in general, it's a start, and it's something that is a means of collective organizing outside of the institutional structure of teamsters, labor organizing, the general kind of classical model of organizing, that does and has as its express goal educating workers that kind of see this as, and by design, a black box, that they don't really know how to crack and don't really know how it works. Because one of the things that I really found a lot from my interview sample is workers on these platforms, especially those that um, had been there working on, say, a food delivery app for, say, 2 or 3 months, they were very, very confused about the terms of so-called employment or the terms of platform use, because these aren't technically employees in terms of standard labor law. Um, and there was a lot of misinformation that was spread about what it means to kind of keep your job and not be deactivated on these platforms. So several of the workers that I talked to, both young and old, but particularly among some of the older food delivery drivers, conflated what the apps, and there are various food delivery platform apps that we're all kind of familiar with, but the standard deactivation procedure is the same between them. And the major metric that they look at is whether or not you're kind of completing an order, whether you're delivering an order. And for the app that I call Food to You, right now that stands at 80% of those that you accept have to be delivered or you could be flagged. Now, workers took this to mean, and workers not kind of in the know with not a lot of experience, they took this to mean they had to accept 80% of the orders sent to their phone. So their acceptance rates were very, very high, which in aggregate drives down the wages because they were worried that if they declined too many, rather than not completing them, the completion rate is separate from the acceptance rate, that they would lose access to the platform. Um, so that's one of the things that I noticed is there's just not a lot of education. And the companies themselves, there are tutorials that you click through very quickly, right? Shoshana Zuboff calls this. We're all familiar with it when we sign and there's updated terms of service on Google, right? She calls it click wrap, those
And we
little
don't read
boxes
it.
that we just yeah, that nobody reads. And the tutorials are kind of the same way. Nobody actually reads that. They just want to get started and get working. And when you do start and you get caught up in the game, it becomes somewhat addictive. But there's misinformation across these platforms of what it means to actually be able to keep and stay active on the platform. And that misinformation, I call it opaque control or strategic ambiguity, right? They don't want to be upfront about this, is one of the factors that's driving surplus value and profit generation, is the less that workers know. So I look at kind of decline now as being this positive movement to actually educate, whether it's sort of through online forum like a Facebook, or a lot of message boards that have popped up, like Reddit subreddits that are designed to give gig workers, information about how these algorithms work.
So just to clarify for the people who, want to make some extra income through the ride hailing business, they would, so it's not the low acceptance rate that is problematic, it'd be the low completion rate. So therefore it is okay to decline on uh undesirable orders, I suppose.
It is, yeah. Both for ride hail and for food delivery. I just kind of want to separate them out, but they work in their terms of service are essentially the same. It's a matter of completing the ride, or in food delivery, completing the trip, not declining it. Now, where this gets kind of fuzzy and where some of the platforms themselves have really actually ran afoul of labor law is there are programs, for instance, on Food to You. I call the program Top Foodie, where they promise wage incentives and sort of perks to get higher orders if you accept more orders, which is actually a form of control or employment control that runs afoul of employment law. So there's an argument that can be made that they're acting as employers by making the acceptance of work, which an independent contractor has the right to either accept or complete work according to the terms that they work by. This actually runs afoul. So if you're rewarding workers that have sort of a higher acceptance rate, they're not really independent contractors anymore. At that point, they become employees. And so a ton of the discussion and controversy, and obviously the labor unions have a vested interest in this, and that's why they're doing some organizing around this to kind of change the model in ride hail in particular, with like the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world, to being an employment model. There's a lot of stuff going on in California and New York City, in localized regions like Seattle, to switch it to an employment model. Now, I'll say, I can just speak for my interview sample, is that none of the folks that I talk to want to be, when you explain to them what an employee is, and several of the workers that I talked to understood the distinction between an employee and an independent contractor. Basically, they all want to remain independent contractors. They want to have that freedom and that flexibility to work when they want and to accept and decline orders or rides as they want. But these programs or incentive programs like Top Foodie on the Food to You platform run afoul of that distinction, or graying that distinction between an employee and independent contractor. They're trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, so let's get into that issue of worker misclassification. So you had this one paper, I think, in critical sociology, and that was in the trucking industry, I believe, and you described that there were successful uh, cases of changing the classification from the independent contractor to the regular employee. And and yeah, I guess now that you basically know both kinds of case studies, both in the trucking industry as well as in the ride hailing, where this so-called misclassification is still in effect. Could you describe perhaps like how is the context of the truckers different from the ride hailers, and why is it possible to change the classification in one industry but not the other?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, we wrote with my co-authors Tim Black, who's also at Case Western, and Alicia Smith-Tron, who's a professor, associate professor of sociology at Oberlin now. We looked at and we became interested in worker misclassification. Tim Black had done some work and had contacts that were in the trucking industry and had fallen prey to these like lease to own schemes in trucking. And so we wanted to learn more about kind of that industry, but also in the critical sociology paper that you mentioned, we look at two successful cases, and one is in the California port trucking industry. So port truckers are on average taking these like 40 or 50-mile trips from the ports in LA and Long Beach to warehousing and distribution centers further inland. And they're taking, in some cases, like 5, 6, 7 of these trips a day, being paid piece rate for their trips. A lot of it's done by legal immigrant labor. And there had been a movement afoot led by the Teamsters in California to kind of change that model, because many of the um, again, like largely legal immigrant port truckers were being exploited by leasing to own schemes because they were classified as independent contractors, when in fact the major hauling companies that they were working for were controlling sort of every aspect of the loads they took and the time that they work. And there has been that movement in California had been, we deem it successful. We look at a lot of archival research and how the industry has changed. It's not to say there isn't some misclassification still going on in port trucking, but this Teamsters led campaign created coalitions with localized environmental groups. One group is Lane, the Los Angeles Association for a New Economy. So we see this blue-green alliance form that really contacts or sort of creates a bridge between these truckers and the communities that they drive in, and a lot of the concerns about pollution and noisy trucks. Eventually that was deemed successful, and I can talk about kind of why that's successful, but that was one case that we looked at. One of the reasons it's successful is, as you know, as a political economist, right? It has to do with the regulatory climate in California. More progressive labor law and leaders that are there that are more inclined to regulate and make these major companies to take them to task in front of the National Labor Relations Board or federal court for misclassifying. So there was that context, but then there was also the carpenters union in the northeastern construction trades industry, which was also successful. And we know, somewhat similar to port trucking, that a lot of work that's done in the building trades is done by immigrant labor. That's why this hysteria around immigrant labor when we have a housing crisis and all of these things are intertwined. It's just so maddening what's going on right now with the demonization of people trying to make a better life for their family and come to the United States and contribute to the economy. It's so infuriating. But the carpenters were also successful in changing the industry. And what they did, essentially the carpenters union, is they made contacts with media and would name and shame a lot of these major contractors and builders that exploited not just immigrant labor, but the misclassification model to control workers and to deem these so-called subcontractors independent contractors without any protection. So there's a public relations campaign that really went on with the carpenters to kind of change that model and to get legislation in place in places like Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Connecticut to crack down on what David Weil calls the fissured workplace, or these sort of subcontracted out schemes that exhibit control over work and the way that these workers complete their work without any of the legal obligations that the contractors and the developers have to their workers. So both we deemed successful, but for varying reasons. So the strategy is really one of industrial change, trying to change the ways in which the employers themselves hire and classify workers. And there's limitations to that, especially in a neoliberal environment where everybody kind of wants to be their own boss, as you talked about kind of before, and everybody wants to hustle, and kind of the allure of being an independent contractor without really a lot of knowledge, particularly among new immigrants, of what that means in terms of what they're giving up on the other end, the obligations that workers, the limited obligations, albeit, but the obligations that employers have to their workers, and why they exploit these tenuous independent contractor classifications, even when their working conditions and labor law doesn't deem it justified.
Yeah, I think the carpenter example also demonstrates the importance of like classic labor strategies involving unionization. And certainly, I mean, you know, going back to this, food delivery ride-hailing business where, um, we don't really hear much talk around like actual unionization. I mean, it's fine to look at like, Facebook groups or like WhatsApp groups where like localized forms of like communication and resistance. But I mean, where do you see like the you could say the classic labor power strategy, that is to say unionization, collective bargaining, in in this particular sector? Where is it going? I mean, is it a pipe dream? I mean, should we be waiting? Do we see success stories anywhere in this field?
Yeah, so I mean, success stories are mixed, but what I talk about um, in the dissertation is this strategy or this idea that we're going to change the industry of, say, food delivery or ride hail to be an employment-based model. um, there's a lot of pushback by the drivers and the workers themselves that don't want to be labeled as. You can call it ideological, we can call it sort of Marxist false consciousness all we want, but the workers don't necessarily want that. But the what it privileges, what the kind of this strategy, this long-term strategy to create industrial change privileges a lot of the business unionist approaches, right? So you see those that are successful are the ones that have the largest labor funds, or excuse me, legal funds. So this privileges major unions that have been critiqued, and I think rightly so, for years of being undemocratic. So one example, of course, is the Teamsters, which is very active on the issue of changing kind of the industry model from an independent contractor to an employment model. That's the necessary first step to collective bargaining rights and to union recognition. So I don't think in the institutional environment we have, in a situation where we have prevailing labor law that was crafted in the 1930s Fordist era, um, is completely antiquated to what I call platform capitalism. And there's some debate about this, what we call this economic period that we're living in, which maybe we can talk about. I'd like your thoughts of maybe what you call this current economic era. Um, but what we have seen in terms of new models of organizing is co-ops being formed. So in the case of, these are very localized, and again, they're very limited. They're in the nation stages right now, but former software engineers at Uber have, sick of the ways in which these algorithms are withholding information from workers, create the drivers co-op in New York City, which is a co-op based platform that people can download, which is markedly competitive with Uber. Perhaps not enough consumers know about it, but there are efforts underway by folks at like the drivers co-op to expand this co-op model into other regions. So it's completely employee owned. If you're active on the platform, you share in profits. Um, and they're competitive, and in some cases can undercut a lot of the fares that, say, the big players like Uber and Lyft are driving. So there's a co-op movement underway. They're really facing classic economic problems of scale and scaling the business, whereas these platforms have enjoyed network effects because everybody has Uber on their phone. Not everybody, even in New York City, whether you're progressive, you're concerned with labor issues or not, has the drivers co-op on the phone, but that option is available and it's increasing into other markets, and they're trying to scale this. Um, Now that's obviously that's not classic labor organizing that they're doing, but it's co-op and it reflects, Eric Olin Wright's idea of real utopias that can be achieved. And thankfully, there's a lot of smart people that have left and are frankly sickened by um, algorithmic control and the practices that these platforms enact to control workers, that they're creating their own software to serve sort of progressive and worker-oriented ends.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, so I'm not an expert in this co-op movement, but from what I understand of like what the obstacles are to expansion is precisely, this, economies of scale concept, where, if the capitalist firms, my guess is like they are much easier able to attract capital from like, traditional banks and like venture capital, etc. And through that initial cash injection, like they're able to, scale up the platform massively while, any like worker-based co-op, like what's going to be your starting capital? I mean, is it going to be, the combined savings of those workers themselves, which is not that much. So I guess, it's really that starting point that makes it so difficult to scale these co-ops, and then on the consumer side, then you've got the issue, as you say, if you have, I mean, I've got the Uber app, and I don't have uh, any other ride-hailing app on my phone because I'm just not aware of, the co-ops. So in the consumer side, if you're not able to, bring your message across, also, my guess is that the classical capitalist corporations are investing way more in marketing, right? They're doing much more to push out their product to the masses, and so it sounds quite hopeful, but I'm not sure, uh, whether there is going to be significant scale, and then it has an impact also, like for me as a driver, right? If I say, okay, um, so if I want to have, ownership in the company, okay, then I'm going to work for the co-op. But then if there's only very few consumers that are having that particular app on their phone, but I know for sure that they will have the Uber on their phone. So that's why I'm gonna probably maybe even drive 90% of the time. I'll have to drive for Uber or for one of the large ride hailing. So those seem to be like just so at the practical level, kind of what the objections are. I mean, certainly not in a normative side. I think it would be great to have more of them around. Yeah. So, yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to add on the uh, like algorithmic surveillance side of things, especially yeah, maybe some things in the data that are quite surprising and certainly would raise eyebrows among the labor researchers out there.
Oh, sure. So, yeah, I think that just piggybacking on what you said, a lot of those drivers, co-op folks in New York are multi-apping, right? They're active. There's nothing preventing them from having that. This is one of the beauties of being an independent contractor, right? There's nothing preventing them from using the co-op app and say an Uber or Lyft app at the same time. But that's an advantage if these co-op models can be scaled, as you can start to see immediately where if the co-op model and the co-op fares are more beneficial, right? You're not paying over the exorbitant service fees which an Uber collects from drivers. Essentially, the rent seeking in platform capitalism is one of the main means these companies are starting to become profitable. I say starting because companies like DoorDash have not been profitable in terms of their balance sheet yet, but they still are getting lots of investment. Um, so that seems to be, you can do a quick comparison in terms of like how much your fares are for the co-op versus say an Uber, but they're at a distinct disadvantage in terms of not just scale, but one thing I wanted to highlight in terms of kind of the political power that these companies have is, there was this great debate in California and legislation that has come out in the Assembly Bill 5 that gets many of the protections of which get exempted in Prop 22. Prop 22 specifically exempts ride-hail drivers from the protections that were afforded by AB 5. So it was one of the most it was the most expensive lobbying campaign, and we're talking about California, right? A major center of lobbying and economic activity. But this Proposition 22 was the most expensive lobbying campaign in the state's history. Companies like Uber and Postmates and DoorDash chipped in by certain estimates over $200 million to sway the vote. And one of the real, in terms of political power and scale, one of the real nefarious ways in which Uber in particular did this is they built into the app and the algorithm advertisements, which consumers would see about Prop 22 in the lead up to the vote, promising that passage of Prop 22 would provide drivers with health insurance benefits. Outright lying in these advertisements, and after the fact and after it passed by a relatively slim margin, I think 56% to 44%, many of the voters that voted for Prop 22 say they feel duped by these advertisements that they saw when they took an Uber ride. So there's an inordinate amount of political power that these companies have on the consumer side. I still do applaud, these nation efforts to build co-ops within the gig economy, even though they're at a very small scale at this time. But in terms of, I guess, the algorithmic surveillance and why this is important, the writing that I'm doing right now is on how workers kind of overcome this sort of surveillance, and they're not necessarily aware of the data that's being generated when they're on the app, because as I said, sort of nobody reads the terms of service or understands the data that they're giving over to these companies about what orders are being accepted, what the market rates are for certain deliveries, how they can tweak their either rider fees or service fees in a manner that's still going to be kind of market competitive. Workers don't have that knowledge, and a lot of the sort of even the tips get hidden via this algorithmic control. Or in the case of one of my interviewees, who was a full-timer on what I call Grocery Getter, which was a very essential service during the pandemic. A lot of folks were getting their groceries delivered, and particularly middle-class folks that could afford the service, that didn't want to go into a grocery store. As she was able to document, came with an entire dossier of communications that she had with Grocery Getter chat and support staff that documented how her wages were being stolen. I mean, rampant wage theft was happening in the way they were calculating her mileage. And if workers don't have third-party apps calculating their mileage and really pay attention to these things, it's again that kind of disadvantage that they're at in terms of information. So much of it we're kind of left to our own devices in terms of tracking and holding these companies accountable and honest that they're living up to mileage and rate fees when they control that. And workers that get caught up in this game of driving 10 hours a day are on to the next trip. They're not constantly scrutinizing their pay rate and the mileage fees and the service fees and also tips. So much of this is essentially relies on customers giving tips, which drivers still pay taxes on. So there's just a lot of I'll call it misinformation or a lack of information that workers have when they go into this kind of work.
So, I mean, is that wage theft, I mean, only discovered like when the workers sit down and they, I don't know, they have to report their quarterly income taxes or something like that as a contractor, and then they tally things up and they're like, oh, smokes, I thought I was making, way more than what's on the paper. I mean, like, how do these things get uncovered?
In the case of this particular worker, because she was doing it full time, she had downloaded, and there's a plethora of these third-party apps which will track mileage. One of them is called Solo. There's another one called Para that allow workers to track mileage for tax purposes. But she was using the app and saw discrepancies between uh, the mileage driven and what she was being paid. It was something like 25% in her case, the mileage fee that wasn't being paid. So she was being paid 25% for that. And in terms of grocery delivery, that's along with tips, that's one of the major service fees that drivers and shoppers get. Is if in my case, I would grocery shop and I would deliver to a lot of Amish families that live out in the country. So like a 14 or 15-mile trip. So they weren't going into the grocery stores, and I would deliver it to Amish homes, which seems kind of strange if you know anything about the Amish, but many of the sects are actually allowed to use cell phones and would rely on this. And so I was driving, fairly far, and the mileage rate in itself was attractive to me if I was getting an extra $10 to drive an extra 5 miles or so. But she uncovered it just through this third party app and through back and forth that she printed out to me with these um, chat centers or support centers. Much of this is Jamie Cock in his work has shown are these kind of international call centers for Food to You. They have their call centers are mainly in the Philippines. She documented it all via email that they eventually did admit and paid her back pay in the form of hundreds of dollars that she was owed for one particular pay period. It was like a month long thing, but she had to be very vigilant. And on top of that, and outside of kind of just the time to document it and go back and forth with support staff and call centers, she wasn't paid for that. And that took her like 5 hours, but she did it out of a sense of kind of indignation. And it was interesting to see this young woman show up with an entire file of all of this to show me how they were trying to get away with stealing tips. And I mean, she even said to me in the interview, if they're doing this to everybody, and people aren't calling them on it, they're going to keep doing it if people don't know about it and actually call them on it. And she did, and I documented in the dissertation.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think she makes a very good point because, if you think about the way how corporate malfeasance oftentimes works, is that, they're kind of pricing in the fines that they would have to pay back, let's say, to the government. Like, let's say you have a bank that,
Absolutely.
was screwing things up, and then they make, let's say, $10 billion in profits, and then they're waiting for the government to sue them, and then they pay back, let's say, you know, 1 billion, so they get to keep $9 billion, and so they're
Yeah,
just
that's
setting
something that
aside
obviously we
those
we
fees.
completely learned from the Great Recession, right? Is AIG and Lehman Brothers, this is the cost of doing business, and it's baked into the actuary model. So I'm sure there's somewhere in, the back rooms or corporate offices of Grocery Getter, they know that there's a risk that they're running, but they're going to continue to do it until they're called on it. I mean, it's the cost of doing business that they engage in this malfeasance, as you called it. Yeah.
Well, unless there's some form of legislation, right? I think that would basically um, prohibit this kind of practice, and that would be more meaningful. But you were mentioning the call center workers, and I was reminded of a qualitative work that one of my colleagues back at Princeton was making. I think Diana Enriquez. It was about automating middle management, and she also similarly studied the ride-hailing business. And the idea was, well, I mean, you like the company, like Uber or Lyft. I mean, they can reduce the middle management expenses on their own end, right? By basically having fewer people within like the HR office. Um, but you still have HR tasks, right? For let's say these delivery drivers. Um, like what if you had to call in sick, right? Or what is the yeah, how do you handle compensation on that? And um, and so basically, what happens is that those HR functions get transferred onto the app, and now the workers themselves have to figure out, like, basically scrolling through their phone and looking through the options, how to obtain the things that should have been done in a regular HR office, right? So, is there something that you had observed, right? This idea of like faulty automation by design that adds more tasks to the frontline workers.
Yeah, I think it's in the form of, so for instance, um, a lot of these apps recently, and of the four that I studied, two of them have done this post peak pandemic. So since 2003, a lot of them have gone to um, in-app or chat only support, which is what I think you're kind of alluding to, which, I mean, just from a safety perspective, isn't isn't a good idea for people that are like driving. You know, one of the great things is like you can have a hands-free conversation through the app and through your speakerphone or through your this sort of audio visual setup in your vehicle if it's a newer model vehicle. But several of the apps now to even be elevated within that kind of support structure, help center structure, you first need to navigate a bot. And then the bot will key on certain terms that you need to use in term to elevate and actually get somebody on the phone. But you do have to go through, there's no phone number anymore. There's no phone number to link directly to um, food to use support, for instance, where you used to be able to call a phone number. Now you have to navigate a chat bot and say the right keywords in order to be elevated. And frankly, most people, when you talk to them, give up, whether it's navigating the chat bot or even waiting to get on the phone with somebody um, at support. Uh, and I think that, I'm speculating, but I think that's by design, right? Like wait time. So for instance, on food to you, um, or 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 on some of the other competing food delivery platforms, if something goes wrong, say at the restaurant or the local McDonald's, they didn't get an order, you would have to go through this long process which in many cases would take like 20 or 25 minutes to get somebody on the phone in order to get, say, a 10% cancellation fee, which who wants to be on the phone for 20 or 25 minutes to get $1.50? So most people would just take the ding on their metric and drop the order, which goes against that sort of completion percentage, rather than wait and lose out on the wages or the trips that they might get while waiting. It's a frustration that's generally the people that are in food delivery in my sample said they wouldn't even really mess with. Some would do it out of principle, many would comment like, I don't want the customer waiting. I want them to know, out of a sort of worker conscientiousness. I want the customer to know this restaurant is having an issue. But most people, when you learned and you dealt with and had to navigate either these chatbots or support staff, would just end up dropping the order and then moving on because that made the most sense, which makes it kind of highly inefficient, but beneficial because then the algorithm will pass it on to the next driver, which pushes the delivery time back, gives the restaurant more time to complete the order if they're having issues. But it is kind of it's a nightmare, and especially on those apps that are now just purely chat bots. You have to pull over. I know on my vehicle, I can't even, engage with the Android system or on the phone unless my car is parked. So I can't chat, I can't text or anything like that. And that's a good design feature. But these chatbots are not good design features in terms of safety, worker safety or public safety.
I remember I was reviewing this book by Luke Munn, Munn, and it was about, I think, automation is a myth, and kind of one of the core arguments is that this like high technology workplaces that are sold to the public as being labor saving, because they have integrate so much technology in it, actually have a significant amount of hidden labor. Because ultimately, I mean, even if you install a robot, let's say, into a factory that is supposed to do things, there are certain gaps in what it can do. So, in order to make up for these gaps, you hire a person who has to basically fill those gaps, right? To basically be able to complete the tasks that the robot is doing. Um, and um, and so in that way, yeah, you're making the workers being kind of the servants of those robots.
Right.
But that principle seems to suggest that, yeah, and I guess now we can go to this issue of, like, future without work discourse. Yeah, is it actually feasible to get to the workless future? I mean, or is the logic of capitalism, if we accept this whole Marxian framework, that since it is based on the generation of surplus value, and the surplus value comes from the so-called variable capital, which is labor. Um, Essentially, so if we accept the Marxist paradigm, capitalism cannot survive without workers, right? Um, but then if we accept the techno-futurist argument, um, then eliminating labor is a be all end all, perhaps even of capitalism. So I don't know. Just what is your take on this debate here?
Well, I think it's interesting. And it's been interesting for I was talking to this is one of my questions or comments on your great paper that you did about the implications of AI from a Ricardian and Marxist framework. Is I think it's an interesting discussion to have, and I've seen like a lot of the sociologists of technology and work really focus a lot on this idea of a future without work. And yes, in the orthodox Marxist framework, that it's not possible without labor, right? Which is the fun or labor power, which is the fundamental building block of capital accumulation. Um, but I think, I mean, for me, and what I write in the dissertation is this kind of this fascination with it that dates back to Saint Simon and Robert Owen, I should say. Like the longest lived Owenite settlement is here in my hometown of Massillon, Ohio. It was called Kendall, and it lasted 2 years, and that was the most successful sort of Owenite utopian settlement. So we have that as a kind of claim to fame here in sort of former steel town Massillon, Ohio. It was a fascination of Marx, right? And many of the, although he critiqued utopian socialism, but there was this idea or this approach to technology that it could be liberating in a post-capitalist future. But I'm kind of taken aback by the amount of sociologists that are actually writing about it because I see this kind of pattern in this discourse about a future without work in particular. I'm more on the kind of the future of work side of it. But this pattern where, dating back to Marx, there's a lot of, writing about this utopian future of being and a lot of dystopian writing that comes after a lot of intellectual or philosophical work in this vein. And it gets picked up by the popular imagination. And I think we're seeing it today with like these platform tycoons like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, right, that are now trying to escape the planet on their spaceships and colonize, I don't know, Mars uh, or whatever. But I think what that, I make the point in the dissertation that it's actually kind of distracting us from material reality and what's going on right now and how it's affecting workers, precarious work. It's a fun kind of cocktail hour conversation to kind of consider um, what the implications of technology will be in the future, but it doesn't do much for workers in the here and now that are trying to navigate these technologies to provide for their families. So I kind of see it as a bit of a distraction for the sociological work that's necessary right now in a materialist conception of political economy and social life. These are just my thoughts and kind of my critiques. And you're looking at your CV. This is something I know that you're really, really fascinated with, and you know a lot more about AI than I do. So um, I, I, I welcome, a discussion about what structural unemployment may look like, but I'm not so sure, and I'm not holding out much hope for a future without work.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I just on the Jeff Bezos point. I mean, I remember when he once came back from one of his, I think, Blue Origin trips to space. And then, of course, the reporters were, waiting with the microphones. And he was basically saying, and you guys paid for it, right? So, and of course, he was referring to the, Amazon workers, in the warehouses and the delivery drivers and so forth. Um, and so, even for, somebody who is living in like this, techno future, so to speak, um, even Bezos is aware that he could only enjoy it because there were people that provided him with the surplus labor, right?
Right.
And
Massive surplus labor that goes into these the R&D and these sort of techno future vacations that folks like Musk and Bezos are taking. Yes.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, the point of distraction, I think it cannot be dismissed because I mean, I think the core piece of your empirical writing is to say that look at all of this exploitation and the maltreatment of the current labor force. Um, and I mean, one of the most shocking accounts of labor in the 21st century, I would say, is I think Siddharth Kara, who did a study on um, child labor in cobalt mining in Congo. And yeah, I mean, quite harrowing conditions in which basically children are working because they have small bodies, so they can go down into the mine shaft. They have small hands with which they can scrape the cobalt out of the ground. Um, and um, and if you think about it, I mean, in our entire uh, modern day economy is run on these strategic resources, like cobalt and
Right.
lithium and so forth, right? I mean, right now, I mean, if the whole discourse is around the transportation revolution, right? We want people to drive these electric cars. Yeah, we want people to install the solar panels on the roofs. We want people to participate in this low carbon future. And but if you're trying to do these things, um, there is some kind of labor cost that is involved in some part of the chain, the production chain, and especially you know like minerals and resources that are drawn from the ground. Um, and it does at present. I mean, yes, I mean it requires the displacement of sometimes indigenous populations. Like if you look at lithium mines in Chile, for instance, right? So um, yeah, so yeah, I do think there's something to your point that like that there's too clean of a story of this techno optimism. Um, but then again, it's like um if you look at like let's say the capabilities of chat GPT, for instance, right? um where you could make the argument that not all of the white collar professional tasks are going to be displaceable by the technology. um but some aspects will be, right? So I mean, I just like N of one. I mean, I know that, like, if you write, like, let's say a method section of a paper, which oftentimes I believe is very formulaic,
Yes.
you know, I could just type up, let's say, two sentences, just stating basically whatever participant observation, whatever details of the field site, and I could spit out, instead of typing it on my own, I could spit out like 5, 6 paragraphs that would basically be like a full method section of a paper. Um, and and I think it does a pretty good job of that. The free GPT version where it doesn't do a good job, like for instance, like literature reviews, like drawing like the most recent literature in a particular subfield, summarizing those. Um, though I'm sure those AI already exist to do that as well. Um, so yeah, and then you kind of do ask yourself, I mean, if I can get this AI to do to do my research for me, and that's just for one field, for one sector. Um, what does it mean, for instance, for computer coders, right? Where a lot of your work is about patching up like faulty code, for instance, in systems. If you can feed that to an algorithm, or even if it's not full automation, like let's say you're increasing the productivity of the existing let's say computer coders, and then you have, let's say, a corporate department of, let's say, 10 coders instead of 100 or 200, right? So I think I think there is some threat um of the displacement, and capabilities that are in effect that were not in existence even a few years ago. Um, and one of the concepts that the AI people talk about, I guess, is like the exponential function, right? Um, which is the idea that like progress in the early period appears to be very small, very minuscule, but then it does speed up towards the end, right? So I mean, it takes from the beginning of time until 2022 for a first version of GPT to come out. and now every couple months is like a new version of GPT, and it does have higher computing capabilities. So um, yeah, I mean, but just like with any researcher, I mean, I'm also just observing this as it happens. So I don't know whether we can have work free future. Um, but in this kind of discourse, I mean, I do like this Paul Lafargue thesis. There was a son-in-law of Marx. The right to be lazy, right? And essentially, I mean, the main argument being that we kind of do want to live in a world where like the obligatory labor, right? The labor that and the labor that involves exploitation. Um, I think that should be minimized. And then I think the only labor that should be done, in my view, is the one that people actually enjoy doing, right? So I mean, in a future world, I think that people are still going to be running podcasts, for instance, because I think people think it's fun to do, right? I mean,
Right.
uncompensated activity. Um, uh,
For now, until you get enough followers that you could monetize it on YouTube.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's still like we're still thousands of views away from that, right? Um, but so that's why I mean I think uh the so there's this discussion about leisure society, and I am very favorable towards that, but I know that among the sociology of work scholars, I think because they want to study basically the problems of today, right? And they want to put the whole focus on that. And and that's fair enough too. I think that because we have a lot of problems in the world of work today, and I think they should be addressed. Uh, but again, yeah, but I'm not in a position to throw out the futurist discourse either. So
Yeah,
um,
I guess I don't really know enough about like the chat GPT and a lot of these language models that I know you know a lot more, but I mean my basic understanding is that they're essentially just mirrors of aggregate language that don't necessarily capture the future or dynamism or change or innovation, right? They're static in nature, right? There's this they're not sentient in the point where they could innovate or create new ideas. They can just aggregate what's existing out there. And I'm kind of struck by the connection that you make, which I think is an important one because I talk about the connection that you make to extractive labor, right, in Africa. Because I talk about a lot of the work that went on in the pandemic, and this chapter I have on precarity and risk is the these laborers and these workers is essentially hidden, right? And I think this goes back to Marx's analysis kind of the fetishism and the hiddenness of labor, the social value that gets hidden from us, is that all of this stuff that's making the techno future possible or what's in our cell phones we don't necessarily reckon with or reflect on the extractive and exploitative labor in Africa and the Congo and places like that, where it's seems to me to be both in industrial capitalism and in platform capitalism. Like there's this logic of hiddenness, hiding the socially deleterious effects of capitalism from consumers, and that's I mean, I think it's real poignant that you point out really what goes into like creating all of this stuff in our kind of digital presence rests on uh, really deplorable labor conditions in the developing world and in particular in Africa. But yeah, I guess I just yeah, I don't know enough about AI, but in terms of your point um, about liberation, right, or the obligatory labor that we don't want to do, uh, I could see I could see the chat GPT and these various like language AI models replacing what we do in our day job. You in particular, right, as a professor, it could probably teach your classes. I mean, maybe not as good or in a dynamic way as you can, um, but it can do that kind of work of just exposing students to what's already existing. But I mean, consider me kind of selfish here, but it's maybe it's a function of the kind of research, the ethnographic research that I do. It can't necessarily do that because that's based on relationships that you develop and trust and the dynamism of the field. So I think qualitative researchers, ethnographers, probably in particular, or participant observers, are going to be safe from this for a while. But I'm sure there are entire task force at, um, major universities looking at the implementation of AI in terms of teaching and learning for like undergraduate students. And I don't know about you, Larry. Maybe you find do you find teaching obligatory? It's just something that like strikes me. I teach a lot of like online classes, which probably could there's a lot of correspondence that goes on in them, and I like to, post things about current events and things that are going on. But and that seems to me to be one avenue where we could be freed from that obligatory labor. Not that I don't enjoy teaching; it's just my thoughts that came to mind.
Yeah, because I'm teaching. I think there's like fun and less fun parts of it. So I would say that yeah, if it's like a graduate course, I mean, I'm very fortunate because I was put in two graduate courses, both in theory, contemporary and classical, and yeah, those classes, I think it would be very sad if it was getting automated because you want if you have a good crop of students, right, which fortunately we have, then you know you want to hear those discussions, right? You want the students to grapple with the readings. You want them to apply those readings to their own research area. They sometimes ask you questions, and then you have to think very hard about, certain elements within the reading that you had not thought about in the prep work. And so I think that's actually fun, and you want to have more of that. Um, yeah, I mean, if it's like the intro to sociology, which I also taught before, where okay, it's very formulaic. You have 16 chapters in a textbook. You do one chapter a week, and oftentimes what I did was, I had like the list of the vocabulary for that week, right? The terms for that week, and I just go over them, and yeah, I mean, maybe there's like more colorful and better ways to explain intro to social to people, but um yeah, I mean, like that would be one of those courses where if, like AI would do it for me, I'd probably be happy with that. Now, but then the issue is that again, we go back to this like kind of oppressive capitalist system logic, right? Where it's it's probably not going to work this way, right? It's like nobody's going to ask us, hey, you're going to want to teach the theory class, but you don't want to teach the intro class. Um, it's oftentimes much more oppressive than that, which is to say, you know, uh, either if it's low technology, then you the instructor, you take on extra course load, right? Work for us, free labor and stuff. Or if it is, um, kind of like the MOOC direction, the massive open online courses, right? Um, very low instructor headcount, right? Fees, but a lot of tuition revenues from the students. I mean, then but it's very sad from the labor side of things because it's either going to be what we're going to be overworked or we're going to be underworked, and then we're going to be felt obsolete. um and that's really, I think, the source of the unhappiness, right? Because I think people like to have self-determination. They want to have stability in their schedules and stability of their
But
income and stuff.
to like great David Graeber's point though, right? Like we do want to cut out all of the especially in academia, all of the dead weight, and so much of it is right administrative. Um, yeah, people that are doing kind of the meaningless, already alienating stuff that isn't really contributing anything of social value. Um, but I guess it takes you back to like just the point in my baseline understanding of AI is that it's static and it's not innovative and creative in the way that humans are. Like, so I teach the undergraduate theory, and that's it can be as stimulating depending on your like your crop of students and the level of interest and sort of those ineffable things that you get when you get new students together with different ideas. But I'm thinking of it in terms of also like a method seminar where you have a group of graduate students or colleagues that get together to talk about their projects, their methodological approaches, their early findings. And I don't ever see that stuff being automated or I guess I'm making an argument here that's very anti-Kuhnian, that science is very progressive and very kind of like innovative, and if we're just aping what's already out there, then it's not really progressing, and that's kind of my understanding of AI. But my other understanding of AI is just kind of generally cynical and skeptical. And I don't know if you know this, but do you know what like Jeff Bezos privately refers to AI as? Have you heard this
No,
anecdote?
I have not heard of it about it.
He called it to like shareholders and in private. He calls it artificial intelligence. And what he means by that is that AI and coding and takes a whole army of micro task workers. This is in a great book is Phil Jones. He has this short book. It was in Verso like 3 years ago. It's published called Work Without the Worker. And it's in that where Bezos, they have that infamous, and that was actually going to be one of my cases early on, the Mechanical Turk platform of Amazon, which is all of these sort of micro tasks. And now researchers just use it to do a lot of survey research. There's other stuff that goes on, but the point being gets back to the really poignant connection you make between the extractive labor that goes on to power this platform economy and digital economy is it still does rely on a lot of human labor. And in terms of, I'm thinking about like AI and labor process in theoretical terms. And I know we're kind of running out of time, so maybe we could talk about it, maybe a future episode or something. That the AI models are essentially calling or um, collating a lot of immaterial labor. There's this whole literature on immaterial labor and the immaterial labor that we engage in even when we're like using Google. We don't think of in terms of work and labor, but it's a way in which value is generated through clicks. Is these models are actually capturing a lot of mental and physical labor that's been done without remuneration. Is just something that kind of strikes me, or something that I cynically think about these AI models as doing. But I'm a Marxist that always thinks about this as like, where's the value being created, and where's the exploitation taking place here? And it seems like a victimless sort of situation of generating surplus value through a lot of existing mental labor and work that's been done.
Yeah, and then also like the way how we're improving these algorithms, it is by interacting with these. AI platforms, right? So we're inputting more data, and and in that way, it kind of becomes better and better. And so, I mean, like Google searches are really good because almost everybody that does any web searches is using their platform, right? So they can iteratively improve their search algorithms. And yeah, and so I mean, so I guess I mean the main takeaway seems to be that I guess as long as people are alive, that that labor is a crucial component, right? I mean, we have to contribute in some way um, to the to the system, and very few people are able to escape it. Maybe if you're like a retiree, or if you have won the lottery, or a rich family or something like that. I mean, but for most people, I think we're kind of going to be remain the hamsters in the wheel, more or less, right? Okay, if you have like a last word, otherwise I'll
No,
come
I
to
think
an
that's
end.
yeah, I think that's really well said. I just yeah, I would just underscore that my work is just trying to focus on what we can do in the here and now, and really delving into and kind of unmasking these processes of hiddenness that I see as kind of a continuity of capitalism from the industrial past to the platform present. These workers during the pandemic were hidden. They remain hidden and sort of unheralded. But the discourse and debate and dreams of platform tycoons like Musk and Bezos for a interplanetary capitalism or future without work kind of uh, distracts from the here and now, the exploitation and the processes of exploitation that I think sociologists of work should be focused on.
Okay. Yep. So thank you very much, Michael, for very pleasurable and insightful perspectives on the platform work. And I'm sure there's way more research to be done on this field. Maybe a very last question is, what's next for you, right? Where do you want to
Uh,
take this research?
yeah, so one of the things that I'm toying with is this research. The here and now, all I'm thinking about is completing the final chapter and defending the dissertation this by the end of this fall. But I'm also interested in, I guess, as just a consumer or a budding theorist in the whole creator economy or influencer economy as the next topic to explore sociologically, not as a participant observer, but maybe doing some work around like interview-based work on the creator economy once I've completed this project on the so-called gig or platform economy.
It sounds like a very exciting project as well. And so best of luck on that and your future studies. And yeah, thank you for coming on, Michael.
Thanks, Larry.